Good morning. My name is Rudy Shappee. I'm chief docent and historian aboard the USS Midway Museum here in San Diego, California. Um, the museum has spent a number of years researching the Battle of Midway because it is the namesake for our carrier. And there's a lot of confusion about whether this carrier was in the battle or not. So we decided to really focus on the battle, and we built an entire museum around the Battle of Midway. We call it the Voices of Midway. So this morning, what I'm going to do is take you through the battle, and in the hopes of getting some clarity on what happened during those 3 days in 1942. So I begin my story with the attack on Pearl Harbor. It was a very, very successful attack. It was led by Admiral Chichiji Nagomo and the Kudo Butai, which was 6 Japanese carriers. And it was very devastating for the U.S. forces, the battleships, especially that we lost there. But one of the reasons for the attack was to sink the 3 aircraft carriers that were supposed to be in Pearl Harbor that day, and they were all 3 gone. They were all delivering aircraft to Midway and Guam. So the Japanese missed them there. So that the American carriers were still going to be a threat. And Admiral Yamamoto, who was in charge of the Japanese fleet, knew that it was going to be a carrier war, although most admirals believed that it was going to be a refighting of the First World War, as all admirals do as they fight the last war. Yamamoto knew it was going to be an aerial war as a result of the Japanese sinking of the Prince of Wales and the repulse in the during the attack on Malaysia. So Nagumo had to get those carriers. Um, the Japanese were on a roll. They were winning everything that they touched. They were able to conquer. They and the American people were really rocking back on their heels. Roosevelt needed some some good news for the American people, so they came up with this plan to get these 16 B-25 Mitchells medium bombers aboard the USS Hornet and get the Hornet as close to Japan as possible and launch these aircraft to bomb the island of Honshu. Um, they had to launch earlier than anticipated because they were spotted by a Japanese patrol craft. They were loaded with fuel and not many bombs. Because of the long distance to have it flew, each of them had a very limited bomb load. So when they reached Japan and bombed the island and Tokyo area, um, it was the first time that Japan had been attacked by a foreign country since the 13th century. And the emperor was very upset, and Yamamoto had to go to him and apologize personally and tell him that this would never happen again. Uh, the dilemma for the Japanese was, where did those aircraft come from? And Roosevelt said they came from Shangri-La, that mythical kingdom in the Himalayas. But of course, Yamamoto wasn't excuse me, wasn't born yesterday, and he knew they had to come from either the Aleutian Islands or the island of Midway, which were the closest to the Japanese home islands. So he came up with this plan to extend the Japanese area to the east to include Midway Island and the Aleutians for 2 reasons, actually for 3. The Aleutians, because then they would have the propaganda coup of having landed soldiers on an American protectorate in the Aleutians. But remember, Alaska was still just a territory. And that was a big plan by the Japanese army. And then Midway was important to Yamamoto because he was hoping that by attacking the Midway Islands, he would draw out those carriers from Hawaii or from the Pacific, wherever they were, into battle so he could sink them. And also, by capturing Midway Island, he would have then an air base for his long range bombers to attack Hawaii again. and force the American fleet back to the Pacific coast of the United States. This would effectively take the United States out of the war and give the Japanese access to the Coral Sea, New Caledonia, Fiji down the south, and cut Australia off from any assistance other than all the way through the Indian Ocean. So it was going to be a slam dunk to secure all of those regions and protect Japan from any further attacks. So the Battle of the Coral Sea was fought May 4th to 8th, and this was the first time that two battle forces, naval battle forces, confronted one another without seeing one another. It was all done by aircraft. And although it was a tactical loss for the United States because we lost the USS Lexington and the Yorktown was very badly damaged, and the Japanese actually thought they had sunk the Yorktown. The Yorktown was able to get back to Hawaii, limp back, and to be repaired. So this stops the Japanese from landing at Port Moresby, New Guinea, and shutting off the Australians from the rest of from any support. So this is the first time the Japanese are unsuccessful in one of their battle plans. So what Yamamoto wants to do is Yamamoto was a poker player. He had been stationed in the Japanese embassy in the United States for a number of years. He knew the Americans very well. He knew that the Japanese had to stop the American forces, neutralize them within 3 to 6 months of the attack on Pearl Harbor, because he knew of the industrial power of the United States. And once it was geared up, he was afraid that there was no way that they could win against that production. Also, he knew that while he was in the United States, American attitudes towards war was very passive. So he didn't think the Americans, even after Pearl Harbor, would be willing to actually enter a war against Japan. Of course, he was wrong in a number of situations. But his plan is very, very complex. It includes hundreds of ships and strewn all the way from the first attack force all the way back to Japan. So he has this first carrier force, the Kudo Butai, which originally, as I said, consisted of 6 Japanese carriers, but 2 of them were badly damaged during the Battle of Coral Sea. So he's down to 4 carriers. He also lost quite a few aircraft during the Battle of Coral Sea. He's also going to bring up, so he's got this carrier force that's going to hit Midway and neutralize the island, and then find the U.S. carriers and attack them. So Nagumo, his admiral in charge of the Kudo Butai, has 2 missions, which require 2 different kinds of weapons, which is going to play an important role later in the battle. Then Yamamoto is in the second van, and he has these heavy battleships. And if he can find the U.S. carriers, he's just going to batter them to pieces and also support the landings on Midway. And then he has Admiral Kondo, who is coming in from the south, who's bringing in the Japanese landing force, the Army landing force, to capture the islands. The Aleutian Islands is a second separate invasion. Originally, we thought that it was a feint, but it was a major invasion insisted upon by the Japanese Army. It's the only way that Yamamoto could get his attack on Midway Island approved, was to also concede to the Japanese Army and say that he would send a force up there. So that also reduces the number of aircraft and carriers that he has available for the Midway attack, because he has to send some north to the Aleutians. So this is, I'll give you some idea of what the battle layout is. The red forces are the Japanese, and you can see that he has actually 3 strike forces. The northern force going to Kiska and Attu, the carrier force, which is going to be attacking Midway, and then that's followed by Yamamoto with his main force, and then from the south is the invasion force, the freighters and the passenger liners and all this kind of stuff that's going to be carrying the army in. And he also, you see in the right-hand corner, an advanced force. These are submarines, 24 submarines that he sends over to lie in wait off French Frigate Shoals, which is between the Hawaiian Islands and Midway. And he figures that once he attacks the Midway Island, the carriers will then come out of Hawaii and be forced to move north. And then they would have to go through this barrier of Japanese submarines, which would sink as many of them as possible before they even reach the battle area. So it's a very complex uh, plan, very well planned out, but sometimes too many moving parts. This is what Yamamoto needs to sink. He needs to sink these 3 aircraft carriers. And the Yorktown, of course, has been badly damaged in the Battle of Coral Sea. But the Hornet and the Enterprise are still available. There's one other carrier in the Pacific coast, but it's too far away for it to ever reach the battle area. Now, the Japanese presume that the Yorktown was sunk during the Battle of Coral Sea. So they're only looking for the Hornet and the Enterprise originally. The key to the battle was intelligence. In 1942, naval intelligence was really in its infancy. There was more bad intelligence than good. And this fellow by the name of Commander Rochefort is in charge of intelligence station Hypo in the basement of the command structure on Ford Island. And he's been monitoring the Japanese radio traffic for a number of years. He was stationed in Japan in the embassy as an intelligence officer. He lived there for 2 years. He knows quite a bit about Japanese culture, and he has been busy breaking the Japanese JN25 code for some time. An interesting side story is that who works for Commander Rochefort? How does he recruit intelligence people who are code breakers? He brings in musicians from the fleet bands because music is a code. And so these young men are able to transition their skills from reading music to reading code patterns. And they also have IBM punch cards that they use. So he's been monitoring the traffic. He hasn't completely broken the code, but he's pretty close. They could find out quite a bit from what they're hearing from the different Japanese ships and stations. So the Admiral Nimitz, who's in charge of the Pacific Fleet, works for Admiral King, who is back in Washington, D.C. And Admiral King's intelligence network says that the major thrust is going to be against the Aleutian Islands, and that Nimitz is to send his forces there to counter that attack. Rochefort tells Nimitz that they're coming to Midway. And so Nimitz is torn about where is he going to send his forces. So Rochefort says, let me play a trick on the Japanese and see if they bite. In 1925, 26, 27, an underwater telegraph cable was laid between San Francisco and Hawaii to Guam to Wake to Japan. When the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor, that cable was broken at Midway, so there was no further transmissions capable of being sent between Midway and Japan. However, it was still in place between Midway and Hawaii. So Roosevelt says, let me send, using the underwater cable that the Japanese can't monitor, a message to Midway telling them to broadcast in the clear an emergency message saying that their water purification system has broken down and they have no water and no fresh water, and this is an emergency. Please send a ship over as soon as possible. 6 hours after that message is transmitted from Midway Island, the Japanese send to their fleet at sea that they need to take extra fresh water to the invasion forces against AF, which was the code name for Midway. So Roosevelt was able to say, they're coming at Midway, that's their major thrust. And so Nimitz was able to position his carriers appropriately to ambush those Japanese forces. The order of battle is seen here. A CV or aircraft carriers, BBs or battleships, CAs and CLs are light and heavy cruisers. Ships, these are freighters, oilers, support ships, seaplane carriers, all these support ships in the van. Their aircraft, the carrier aircraft, the Japanese have 223. We have 233. We also have 122 land-based aircraft on Midway Island. Now that looks really encouraging that we have so many airplanes and they have so few, but we're going to find out that many of the land-based aircraft cannot be used in this battle, such as patrol PBY patrol aircraft. And also many of them are obsolete and are really just cannon fodder for the Japanese to shoot down. So the aircraft, the actual aircraft, this should be interesting to you folks, the TBD Devastator. This was the first mono-wing torpedo bomber in the United States Navy fleet. It was an old airplane, a 1930s aircraft. The pilots who flew it called it the Vibrator. It flew at about 120 miles an hour. It had to be under 100 miles an hour to release its torpedo, and had to fly on a straight course while aiming the torpedo and so on. The reason it had to fly under 90 miles an hour is because if it didn't, when it released the torpedo would actually porpoise across the top of the water. And also the torpedo that they were using was very, very, very poor quality. And many of the pilots who flew the Devastator had been so poorly trained that some of them had never even carried a torpedo, let alone launched a torpedo in any kind of exercise. But the Devastator had been flown during the Battle of Coral Sea, and they had been able to successfully launch some of their torpedoes, but with no hits. The F4F Wildcat, that's just like a Mack truck that flies. Very, very powerful aircraft that can take a lot of beating, a lot of protection for the pilot, a lot of protection for the fuel cells, can stay up there and just be shot at and shot at and shot at and still keep flying, and was very successful against the much faster Zero in the air-to-air combat. The SBD Dauntless, a good airplane, a solid aircraft, two-man tail gunner, was used in the Battle of Coral Sea successfully. You'll notice that she carries a bomb, either 1,000-pound bomb underneath the aircraft or two 500-pound out on the wings. So she's a really good airplane, a good dependable aircraft. The aircraft on Midway Island, we have, so they send out, the Army sent out some B-17 Flying Fortresses to the island, and also 4 B-26 Marauders that attacked the Japanese forces. The Buffalo was a Marine aircraft, and Marines always kind of got the leftovers. And this Buffalo was the first mono-winged fighter in the U.S. Navy. She was slow. She was underpowered. It was just nothing good about this aircraft, and the Marines are going to have to defend the island with that. There are 6 TBF Avengers. This is the aircraft that's going to be replacing the Devastator. Actually, these aircraft are part of Torpedo Squadron 8 that's aboard the Hornet. These aircraft are big, they're heavy, they're good aircraft, but of the 6 that are launched against the Japanese, only 2 will return, only 1 will return in a flyable state. And then they have 31 PBY Catalinas that are great for patrol work, night attack with torpedoes. They're successful. Matter of fact, they get the only torpedo hit against the entire Japanese combined fleet, and they do that at night, on the night of the 3-4 of June. But during the rest of the battle attacks on Midway, these aircraft are all sent eastward to be out of the attack area. The Japanese have 3 aircraft that they use. These are all carrier-borne aircraft. The Kate torpedo bomber, a very, very good aircraft. It has a crew of 3. The bomber navigator, torpedo launcher navigator, lies prone during the attack underneath the aircraft and at the bottom of the aircraft, and to aim the weapon. The Val dive bomber, much like the American SBD, a good solid aircraft with a lot of experienced crew. And then of course the Zero, light, fast, no protection for the pilot, no protection for the fuel cells. It's almost made out of cardboard. It's so light, but it's also fast and can turn inside any aircraft the Americans have. So if you get into a turn about a fight in a turn with a zero with the early American fighters, it was a losing deal because they could outturn you. Another advantage that the Japanese had was that Japan had been at war since 1937. So many of the pilots of these aircraft and crews had a lot of experience. They were very, very experienced. Whereas many of the kids who were launched in the attack during Midway, when the American forces attacked the Japanese forces, many of them have no combat experience and are very easily shot down by these experienced Japanese pilots. So the Yorktown has made it back to Pearl Harbor, and they figure it's going to take 90 days to repair that ship. Nimitz says you've got 72 hours. And so they refloated the ship in 72 hours, and they still had a service force aboard the carrier repairing it as it went north to join the Hornet and Enterprise, who were already heading north to Midway at the beginning of the battle. So the battle begins on 4th of June and lasts until the 7th. This is, again, to give you some idea of the forces. There you can see down the lower right-hand corner, you can see that barrier of Japanese submarines. Spruance is in Task Force 16. He's got the Hornet and the Enterprise. They're already at this place 350 miles northeast of Midway Island at a place they call Point Luck. Fletcher is going to join them 2 days later with the Yorktown, and the Japanese submarines arrive at French Frigate Shoals and lay out their barrier 2 days after Fletcher crosses through the area. So they're too late with their blocking force. And then you see that the carrier task force and the main force, Japanese forces, are coming from the northeast. The transport group and the invasion group are coming from the southwest. So northwest with the attack force, landing force to the south. The first contact with the Japanese forces is made by a PBY out of Midway, and it sees the transport group to the south. So the intelligence that the Americans have is that the Japanese are approaching from the south. None of the ships to the north have been spotted yet. So here's kind of a timeline of the battle. We've got the Enterprise and the Hornet at Point Luck. The Yorktown's coming in 2 days later. June 4th, the morning of 0100, in the morning of June 4th, that PBY spots the Japanese fleet to the south and damages one freighter with a successful torpedo attack. June 4th is the main battle of Midway. 4:45, the Japanese launched their first attack against Midway 97. 121, I think, aircraft are launched. 97 will return. At 7:10, the United States has forces on Midway has radar, and they detect the Japanese forces approaching, and so they launch their aircraft to stop the Japanese. So the fighters, the Buffalo fighters flown by the Marines, are a blocking force against the airstrike, and the B-17s and the Marauders have been sent out to attack the Japanese fleet. Now, you can see the photo in the upper right-hand corner is taken from a B-17, and you can see the bomb hits in the water next to one of the Japanese carriers. The bombers made no hits, but claimed 3 carriers sunk. Then you can see the successful attack on Midway in the lower right-hand corner. The attack was successful. However, it did not knock out the airfield, the runway. And this is going to be a problem for the Japanese. So at 7:55 to 8:20, the second Midway attack force attacks the Japanese fleet. And here we have Devastators, SBDs attacking. There's no hits. The Marines, and also the Marines have dive bombers, the SBD, but they're not trained in dive bombing. They're only trained in glide bombing. So glide bombing is almost like dropping a torpedo. You have to stay on a steady course. You come down slowly, lined up, keep your line up, and then finally drop your bomb. Very easy to be shot down by anti-aircraft or covering aircraft, the carrier air patrol forces. So it's in this time that we have this dilemma that the Japanese have, the problem they have. And I'm going to back up just a hair to give you some idea of what happened to Nagumo. Now, he's informed at 7 o'clock. He was informed by his carrier group commander returning from the strike on Midway that they were going to need that second strike to eliminate the field so that the field couldn't be used by any aircraft from Midway. Now, remember that Nagumo's second job was to attack the American aircraft carriers, the two aircraft carriers they thought were maybe coming into the area. But so he's half of his air force has been launched to attack Midway Island. The other half is kept in reserve with torpedoes and bombs that are going to be used to attack the carriers. So he's got about half of, well, as I said, half of his aircraft are sitting on the deck waiting to be launched. He's launched a number of patrol aircraft, scouting aircraft from the cruisers. The cruisers are have scouting aircraft, and they've launched looking for the American carriers, and all are successfully launched except one from the Tone, which is a cruiser, and they have a problem with their launcher, and that aircraft is launched 30 minutes late. By 8:15, the aircraft that have been striking Midway, the Japanese aircraft, are returning to the Kudo Butai, but they're low on fuel. And remember, Nagumo has to preserve those aircraft because the battle isn't over. So now the question is, should he launch aircraft against the carrier task force, or should he recover those aircraft returning from Midway? And of course, he hasn't found the American carriers, so he decides that he's going to bring those aircraft aboard. So while he's starting to bring those aircraft aboard, at 8:20, the Tone aircraft, that scout aircraft, reports sighting U.S. carriers. So now he's got this dilemma. When he started, he was going to take the torpedoes off of his carrier attack force and replace them with bombs to be used to attack Midway on a second strike. Now that the Tone aircraft says, no, we found the carriers, he then has to change his loading orders and replace those bombs with torpedoes so he can attack the American carriers. This is the decision that changes everything in the battle. Up until this time, the American forces attacking the Japanese have just been devastated by the Japanese aircraft, and they've been very unsuccessful, lost a lot of airplanes out of Midway. So now Nagumo has to change his mind a second time. This happens so fast that the weapons that are being changed are not sent down into the magazines, but are just rolled aside onto the hangar deck of the carriers, and while they're replacing the bombs with torpedoes and vice versa. And then during this time, actually at 8:37, the slide is incorrect, but at 8:37, Torpedo Squadron 8 attacks the Japanese fleet. Now, they're really not a threat, but the Japanese tactics are, when attacked by torpedo aircraft, to go in circles so that the torpedo is launched in a straight line. If you're going in a circle, then it's easy to escape them. And the American tactic is to attack from both sides of the carrier so that one or the other will run into the torpedo. Well, there aren't enough torpedo aircraft with Torpedo Squadron 8. They attack. They have no fighter protection. They've been separated from the rest of the forces. They attack, and only one person releases a torpedo. He gets a miss, and of the 15 aircraft that attack, 15 are destroyed, and only one person survives, Ensign George Gay. At 9:10, Torpedo Squadron 6 from the Enterprise arrives, and they again attack and have no air cover, and they lose 12 of their 14 aircraft are being shot down by the Japanese fighters and also the Japanese anti-aircraft. And from 9:40 until 10, VT3 from the Yorktown attacks, and they lose 10 of their 12 aircraft. So of all the aircraft that are launched that day, only 4 are going to be returning to the ships. Everyone else is killed except for Ensign Gay. But during this time, the Japanese carriers are in hard turns to the left and the right. And during that time, they can't recover aircraft and they can't launch aircraft. And it's very difficult to load weapons in a carrier that's heeled over to the side. And the Japanese are having a field day shooting down those slow devastators and just having a hell of a good time defeating the Americans. And the Japanese continue to think that they're invincible because of this. However, Nagumo has been changing these loads back and forth, delaying his launches, and he finally says he has to recover those aircraft coming back from Midway before he can strike out against the American carriers. So this slows him down quite a bit. So he's got aircraft aboard loaded with bombs and torpedoes, ready to strike the American forces. He's got aircraft returning who are low on fuel that are up on his flight deck. And also another thing is a tactic of the Japanese, when they're under air attack, they do not purge their fuel lines for fueling the aircraft. They keep fuel in the lines, whereas in the American carriers, we purged our fuel lines and charged the fuel lines with CO2. So there's another flammable substance on both on the flight deck and the hangar deck of the carriers when the Americans finally are able to attack. So Wade McCluskey, who's the carrier air group commander on the attacking SBDs, the bombers, has gone south looking for the Japanese strike force as the intelligence told him to do, he spots a Japanese destroyer that's speeding northward at high speed. It had just been prosecuting the Nautilus, which had made an attack on some of the Japanese landing forces and been unsuccessful. And so McCluskey decides to follow that ship and see where it's going, because where it's going must be important. Now McCluskey is a fighter pilot, but because he's the air wing commander, he can fly. He's qualified to fly any plane he wants. He ends up flying a SBD dive bomber. So he finally spots the Japanese fleet at the Kudabutai at 10:20, and so he arranges his forces, and he's joined by the Yorktown dive bombers at 10:22, and they begin their attack at 10:22. Our research says that this was the beginning of the 6 minutes that changed the war, because in 6 minutes the American forces will destroy 3 Japanese carriers. So McCluskey noses over, and being a fighter pilot, his orders to the rest of the dive bombers are, follow me. And of course they all do, and they all are attacking only 1 carrier. And so Lieutenant Best, who's from VB-8, sees that all the airplanes are going in the same direction. So he tells his crew to move off and attack the Soryu as McCluskey is attacking the Kaga. And so he and Best is the only one that scores a hit on the Kaga, but it's a 1,000-pound bomb, and it goes through the flight deck. In those days, all carrier flight decks were made of wood. And so it was very easy to get a bomb through the flight deck into the hangar deck where those torpedoes and bombs are laying about and all that, those charged fuel hoses are. And so by the time the 6 minutes is over from 22 to 28, the Soryu, Akaga, and Kage are all aflame and cannot launch or recover aircraft. The Hiryu, the 4th aircraft carrier in the Kudabutai, is out right on the horizon and is missed by the American attacking forces. So it launches. This is a really good depiction. There's some really good art about the Battle of Midway at the Navy Air Museum in Pensacola, Florida. That's where I got this. So but the Japanese attack the American forces, and they don't know who they're attacking, and they just happen to see the Yorktown. So they attack it, scoring 3 hits, 3 bomb hits, and a torpedo hit. And so the bomb hit hit the island structure and blow out the boilers, and the carrier can't. The engines stop, and she can't get underway. So within an hour, almost 2 hours, they're able to restore the boiler power and launch a strike against the Hiryu. But at 14:30, the second Hiryu attack force finds the Yorktown, scoring 2 torpedo hits. And that bottom right-hand corner show is of the Yorktown as she's heeled over, taking on water. But she's not sinking. But the commanding officer thinks she's sinking, and so he orders abandoned ship. He will later be relieved of command by Nimitz and put on a desk job for the rest of the war because of that decision, instead of trying to save his ship. So the Yorktown is abandoned, and she'll be taken under tow to return to Pearl Harbor. A salvage crew is put aboard her, and she is actually under tow that evening. So on June 4th at 5 o'clock, the Enterprise aircraft dive bombers finally find the Hiryu, and you'll see they just opened her right up. They had hits forward, and it just peeled the forward flight deck right off, and part of it slammed into the superstructure of the carrier, killing everybody on the bridge. So the 4 Japanese carriers are now all burning. They're all incapable of handling any kind of aircraft. Japanese aircraft are landing in the ocean and losing their aircraft and their pilots. So this is kind of an overview of what happened during the battle. You see the Japanese forces in the upper left-hand corner, Midway in the lower right-hand corner, and the American forces in the upper right-hand corner. So you see that the Soryu, the Akaga, and the Kaga are all sunk or all destroyed at about the same time within that 6 minutes. And then the Hiryu is located after it gets a number of strikes off and hits the Yorktown, then it's struck and disabled also. Now these carriers, all of these, the Japanese carriers are only disabled. They are not sunk, okay? They will be sunk later on by Japanese destroyers when it's determined that it would not be worth the Japanese Navy's time to tow them back to Japan and restore them. The Japanese industrial base was very limited at the time of the war. They were mostly an agrarian society, and they had very few machinists and people like that. They were to produce very few ships during the rest of the war. And the main problem with this is that when those 4 carriers were disabled, those fires aboard those carriers killed a majority of the machinists who were aboard those ships. So the Japanese were able to rescue some of their pilots, but the big loss was machinists and armorers and the technicians who kept the airplanes flying. Airplanes that were getting pretty tired by this time because of the battles they'd fought at the Coral Sea and other strikes during the first part of the war. So that was really going to hurt the Japanese Navy. So before Admiral Yamamoto turns away at 0200 on June 6th, he goes ahead and pursues the American carriers. He thinks that Bull Halsey is in charge of the American forces, and Bull Halsey is very, very aggressive. And so he thinks, Yamamoto says, Bull will attack us. The Bull will come after us. And so Yamamoto tells his force, let's go east and we'll attack them with our battleships. It'll be a night battle. We're very good at night battles. We'll destroy the American carriers. But Fletcher is actually, he's a cruiser commander, and he decides to turn to the east, turn away from Midway, during the night uh, to kind of patch up his wounds and decide how the battle's going to go. This actually opens the distance between the two forces, and so Yamamoto can't find Fletcher during the night, so he finally turns away at 0200 in the morning to return to Japan. During that night, two of the heavy cruisers in his van collide and causing an oil leak in one of them. These are really great state-of-the-art cruisers. And the next day, on the 6th, the SBDs find the track of oil on the surface of the ocean and follow it, and disabled the Makuma also, and heavily damage the other Japanese cruiser. So the Japanese end up having to sink this cruiser and four of their carriers as they retreat. Now on the 6th, also the Hornet is under tow back towards Pearl Harbor when the I-168 Japanese submarine in the area spots it. The carrier, or I'm sorry, the destroyer Hayman is alongside the carrier, providing electrical power to the pumps and other equipment aboard the carrier. And it happens to be lying on the side of the carrier that the Japanese attacked from. And so they've launched 4 torpedoes. One hits the carrier, I'm sorry, one hits the destroyer and cuts it in half. And the other 2 hit the Hornet. The Hayman sinks in just a few moments. Most of its crew gets into the water, but they did not safe their depth charges, and so when the stern sank to a certain depth, the depth charges went off and killed a number of the sailors who were in the water near the sinking. The other torpedoes strike the Yorktown, and she goes down. This is the Yorktown, their final moments on the next day. It takes a long time to sink these ships, and you can see where the torpedoes hit in the hull, on the forward side of the hull as she rolled over and then sank. Interestingly enough, when she reached the bottom, she landed keel down. When they finally discovered her in '98, she was lying on the bottom just like she was still cruising. So this is the scorecard. 3,057 pilots and aircraft mechanics and crewmen lost by the Japanese, four fleet carriers and a heavy cruiser, 292 aircraft. It was devastating for the Japanese. They never recovered their losses, and they lost their aviation superiority. They did have some carriers. They still built a few carriers, but they never really had any superiority at all. The Navy was so embarrassed by this loss that only the Emperor was informed. That the rest of the Navy didn't know, the Army didn't know, none of the other defense departments, the Japanese knew. The surviving crews of the carriers and air groups were sent north to the most northern island of Japan, and there they were employed as mechanics and so on, but they were not allowed to communicate with their families until the end of the war, and they were kept totally isolated so the Japanese people wouldn't know that this was a defeat. It was announced that they had sunk all of the American carriers during the battle, and it was a great victory. When the battle was over, Roosevelt didn't want the Japanese to know how many carriers he had, so he announced to the news media that the carriers were sunk, the Japanese carriers were sunk by the B-17s that flew out of Midway and not by the Navy. And that was held secret information until later in the war. So the Army got the credit, and the Navy got the beans, I guess, and clean sheets. But the significance of the battle is now Yamamoto can't force the Americans out of the Pacific. And so Midway was a major submarine base for attacks on the Japanese fleet in the northern part of the Pacific. There was a southern Pacific submarine force out of Australia and a northern force out of Midway. And of course, by being able to keep those submarines at Midway, reduced the transit time to those Japanese waters by 1,200 miles. So it was a great aid to the submarine forces, which were a major factor in the defeat of Japan's ability to make war later throughout the war. So we still were able to keep our surface forces in Hawaii, which was great. Made less distance onto the battlefields in the South Pacific. Roosevelt could now turn to Europe and Churchill and say, okay, now we'll start sending equipment and we'll start looking at the European war first. We're kind of got the Japanese on the defensive here and back on their heels, so there's no threat there. So now we'll start looking at how we're gonna deal with Hitler. And also it means that we're able to protect Alaska. Although the Japanese landings on Attu and Kiska were successful, the Japanese were not able to support them, and those troops were finally evacuated, the majority of them. So we were able to supply the Soviet Union through Alaska, mostly aircraft coming up that way. And some people say that we shortened the war in the Pacific by up to a year. Finally, the last one, that part of the slide is incorrect, as I just found out reading more about the battle. He was told he was the only one in the government of Japan that was told about it. Let's see if there's anything else I can remember. It's time for questions, if there are any. This is the Wildcat that we have in our Battle of Midway exhibit. Beautiful little aircraft that we restored. We also have an SBD hanging from the other side of the hangar that we raised from the bottom of Lake Michigan. Crashed there during the Second World War as pilots were training to land on carriers. We restored it. And then also now we have another aircraft you can't see, which is a TBD Devastator, which does not exist anywhere in the world. They were taken out of service at the end of the Battle of Midway, never used again, trashed, salvaged. And I think there's 3 on the bottom of the ocean. But a production company in Canada just shot the new Battle of Midway movie, which, by the way, we historians think is the best telling of the story thus far. And except for the problems with some of the CG would have ripped the wings right off of the airplanes, but it was nonetheless entertaining. But the history was pretty good. But after they got through shooting that movie, they needed a TBD for the movie to green screen it. And so after the movie was over, we bought the model. It was a 100% model for $61,000 and brought it down from Canada and installed it on our hangar deck flying as part of that mission. So we have the only model of that aircraft. So we have a pretty complete collection. So that's about it. I only see a couple of people here. If either of you have any questions, I'd be happy to answer them for you.
We have one question from one of our attendees. Was the newer movie a couple years ago fairly accurate?
Yes, it was. It was. We have some problems with it. The formula for telling a story in a movie has to include certain elements to be successful. And one of those elements was the wife and child who were present in Honolulu during the attack, and the conflict with the husband having to leave. That story was kind of a generic story of the wives who were stationed, who were still in Pearl Harbor. Most of them had been shipped to the States, had been evacuated before the Pearl Harbor attack. So that was a little fabrication. A problem I have with the movie is that the uniforms worn by the American officers looked like they'd been carried in a wet bag prior to the officers donning them. Even Nimitz's uniform was all wrinkled and ratty looking, and it kind of upset me. And then the third thing was the CG of the aircraft attacking the Japanese fleet. And also the attack on Pearl Harbor. It was very dynamic. It was very well done. You could almost smell the cordite and feel the heat, but those airplanes would have been wingless by the time they got out of some of those maneuvers they were doing. So those are the only problems we have. But the history is all solid.
Well, I think that's the only question that we have. So thank you so much for the presentation. It is recorded and we're going to be sharing it virtually with our virtual flight and members. We appreciate your time and all of the wonderful expertise that you've shared with us.
Okay, I'm going to go back and change some of my slides. Thank you very much.
Absolutely. Have a good one.
Bye-bye.